The town that died in the dark. The Whispering Shadows. Once, nestled deep in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, there was a small town called Black Hollow. You won't find it on any modern map, for it had been swallowed up by the land itself long ago. Black Hollow was the kind of place that people spoke of in hushed tones, the kind of place that existed more in stories than in reality. A town that died in the dark, its tale twisted into the very fabric of local legend. It was a foggy evening when the town first learned of its fate. The sun had dipped beneath the horizon, leaving only a thin sliver of twilight that seemed to stretch on forever. A cold breeze swept through the trees, making the leaves rustle like whispers in the wind. But it wasn't the wind that made the people of Black Hollow uneasy, it was the growing darkness, creeping up from the corners of the earth itself, as if the shadows were alive and reaching for them. The town had always been a quiet place, tucked away from the rest of the world. The people who lived there were hardy folk with a deep respect for the land. They had long relied on the rich forests and clear streams that surrounded them, growing their food and tending to their livestock. They knew the rhythms of nature and the old ways of the mountains. But there was one thing they never talked about, the legends that lurked in the woods. One such legend was of the Night Walkers, creatures said to roam the forest under the cover of darkness. Some said they were spirits, others claimed they were cursed souls of long-dead settlers, but no one knew for sure. The older folk told stories of how, once the sun set and the shadows grew long, the Night Walkers would walk the streets of Black Hollow. Silent and eerie, they would appear out of nowhere, just beyond the glow of the lanterns, vanishing before anyone could speak their names. And if you listened closely enough, you could hear their whispers, low, guttural, like a language lost to time. It was on one such night that things began to change. It started with young Thomas Cray, a boy with a curious mind and a bold heart. He had heard the stories of the Night Walkers all his life, but he wasn't afraid of them. No, Thomas had a fascination with the unknown, and he made up his mind to find out the truth. He was determined to venture into the woods at night, to see if the legends were true. His parents, like all good parents, warned him not to go, telling him that some things were better left untouched. But Thomas didn't listen. So, on the darkest night of the year, when the moon hid its face behind a veil of clouds, Thomas made his way into the woods, armed with nothing but a flickering lantern. He was certain he would find nothing more than a few creatures scurrying about, and the stories would turn out to be just that, stories. But as he wandered deeper into the forest, an unnatural silence fell over the land. Even the wind had stopped its restless howling. The air grew thick with an oppressive stillness, as though the very forest was holding its breath. Every step Thomas took seemed to echo in the quiet, his lantern casting strange, shifting shadows on the ground. And then he heard it, the first whisper. At first he thought it was just the wind, but the sound was too distinct, too deliberate. A voice, soft and faint, speaking words he could not understand. He paused, listening, trying to make sense of the sound. It was coming from deeper within the woods, from a place he'd never dared venture. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest, but his curiosity pushed him forward. He followed the whispers, his lantern now shaking in his grip, casting eerie, contorted shapes on the trees around him. The further he went, the colder it became, and the shadows seemed to grow thicker, like hands reaching out to pull him into the dark. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, though the words still eluded him. They seemed to dance on the edge of his hearing, just out of reach. He was close now, so close that he could almost make out the source of the sound. And then, just as he thought he might catch a glimpse of whatever was causing the voices, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was even worse than the whispers. A cold, suffocating silence that pressed in on him from all sides. And then, from the darkness beyond the reach of his lantern, came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to be human. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He turned, his eyes frantically searching the darkness for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Only the trees, twisted and gnarled, stretching up like clawed hands reaching for the sky. And yet, he could still hear those footsteps, growing closer with every passing moment. His heart raced, his mind screaming at him to turn back. But before he could move, something broke through the trees, a figure, cloaked in darkness, taller than any man had the right to be. It moved with unnatural grace, its form shifting in and out of the shadows like a wisp of smoke. For a moment, Thomas could only stare in horror, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. The figure spoke, its voice a low, mournful growl that seemed to come from the very earth itself. "You should not have come," it said, its words dripping with malice. Thomas's mind raced. He needed to run, but his body refused to obey. Fear had rooted him to the spot, his feet as heavy as stone. The figure took another step forward, and the ground beneath Thomas's feet seemed to tremble. He could hear the sound of whispers again, but this time they were all around him. Hundreds of voices, speaking in unison, chanting words he could not understand. It was as if the very air had become alive with the voices of the long dead, trapped between this world and the next. In that moment Thomas knew. The legends were true. The night walkers were real. And they were not just spirits, they were something far worse, something far older. The figure stepped closer, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark, locking onto Thomas with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. And then, with a final echoing step, it vanished, leaving nothing behind but the sound of distant whispers and the cold, unnerving silence of the forest. Thomas ran. He didn't stop until he burst through the town's outskirts and collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. He told the townsfolk what had happened, what he had seen, but none of them believed him. They had heard the stories of the night walkers, of course, but they had never imagined that the legends were true. But after that night, Black Hollow began to change. People started disappearing, one by one, vanishing without a trace. The shadows seemed to grow darker, and the whispers, once thought to be mere imagination, grew louder. Soon no one dared venture out at night. The town, once full of life, began to fall silent. And then, one by one, the people of Black Hollow started to disappear, swallowed up by the darkness that had always been lurking at the edges of their town. The town that died in the dark was now nothing more than a memory, a warning whispered in the wind, carried from one generation to the next. But even now, on the darkest nights, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the whispers of Black Hollow, calling to those brave, or foolish, enough to seek the truth. And that, my friends, is where Chapter 1 ends. The darkness beckons. Black Hollow had become a place of nightmares. No one dared speak of it anymore, but the whisper still traveled on the wind, carried by those who had ventured too close to its forgotten ruins. The legend had spread far beyond the borders of the town, and many had come searching for the truth, drawn by the eerie tales that seemed to call to them in the quiet of the night. It was a young man named Jacob Harris who first dared to seek the answers that so many had feared to uncover. Jacob was a historian, a scholar of old stories and myths. He had heard the whispers of Black Hollow in the taverns, heard the stories passed from one generation to the next. They spoke of strange occurrences, of eerie lights in the woods, of figures seen in the distance, vanishing without a trace. But Jacob was not one to believe in ghost stories. He was a man of logic and reason, and he was determined to uncover the truth behind the legends. Armed with nothing but a journal, a lantern, and an unshakable curiosity, Jacob set out for Black Hollow one cold autumn evening. The journey was long, winding through dense forests and across steep hills, but Jacob's resolve never wavered. He was not afraid, or so he told himself. He had studied enough to know that every myth had a kernel of truth hidden deep within it. By the time he reached the outskirts of Black Hollow, the sun had long since set. A thick fog had rolled in from the valley, swallowing the landscape in a sea of gray. The trees, gnarled and twisted, loomed like silent sentinels on either side of the path. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and decay, and the faintest chill brushed against Jacob's skin. The town itself was a ghost of its former self. The buildings, once sturdy and well-kept, were now crumbling shells, their windows shattered and doors hanging ajar. It was as if time itself had forgotten Black Hollow, leaving it to rot in the darkness. Jacob stepped carefully, his boots crunching on the gravel as he walked deeper into the heart of the town. It wasn't long before he noticed the first signs that something was wrong. The streets were empty, not a soul in sight. Not a dog barked, not a wind chime jingled. The silence was unnatural, suffocating. As Jacob wandered through the town, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched by something unseen, something that moved in the shadows. He paused outside an old church at the center of the town, its spire twisted like the fingers of a long-dead hand. The door was ajar, and despite his better judgment, Jacob pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and stale air. The pews had been overturned, and strange symbols were carved into the wooden floorboards, symbols Jacob could not decipher. In the far corner of the church, an altar stood, draped in cobwebs as though abandoned for centuries. It was there that Jacob first heard the sound. At first, it was nothing more than a low hum, like the distant buzzing of a swarm of bees. But as the seconds passed, it grew louder, a soft chanting that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the church. The air grew colder, and Jacob felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He glanced around, but there was no one there. The chanting continued, and Jacob, despite his fear, couldn't tear himself away from the sound. He stepped closer to the altar, his heart pounding in his chest. As he reached out to touch the cold stone, the chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by a sudden, deafening silence. That's when he saw it. A figure appeared in the doorway, standing tall and silent. It was cloaked in a long, tattered robe, its face hidden beneath the hood. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as the figure began to move toward him, its footsteps echoing in the stillness of the church. The lantern flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls, and for a moment, Jacob felt as if the very shadows were alive, stretching toward him, reaching for him. The figure spoke in a voice that was not a voice at all, but a whisper that seemed to crawl into Jacob's mind. "You should not have come," it said, its words sending a cold shiver down his spine. Jacob stood frozen, unable to move or speak. The figure raised a hand, pointing at him with a long, bony finger. As it did, the temperature in the room dropped even further, the chill now seeping into Jacob's bones. He could see the figure's eyes now, glowing faintly from beneath the hood, like two distant stars. But they were not stars, they were something much darker, something older. "You are not welcome here," the figure continued, its whisper a hissing sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Jacob's heart raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. The figure stepped closer and Jacob felt his legs go weak. He wanted to run, but his body refused to obey. The whispers in his mind grew louder, drowning out all other thoughts, pulling him into a deep, suffocating fear. Just as the figure was about to reach him, the church doors slammed shut with a thunderous crash, sending Jacob stumbling backward. The room spun around him and for a moment he thought he might pass out. But before he could collect his thoughts, the figure vanished, leaving only the cold, empty silence in its wake. Jacob didn't wait to see if the figure would return. He bolted for the door, his lantern shaking in his hands as he fled into the night. The town seemed even darker now, the shadows closing in around him, as if the very earth was swallowing the light. The fog had thickened, and he could barely see his own hand in front of his face. As he ran, he heard the whispers again, low, guttural voices that seemed to call his name, beckoning him to return to the town. But Jacob didn't look back. He didn't stop until he had crossed the town's border, his legs burning with exhaustion. Only then did he dare slow down, breathing heavily as he glanced over his shoulder. The town was still there, but it was no longer just a town, it was a place of shadows, a place where things that shouldn't exist waited in the dark. And as he stumbled back toward the nearest town, Jacob realized that Black Hollow was not just a place, it was a curse that had been born from the very land itself, and one that would never let go of those foolish enough to seek the truth. The darkness of Black Hollow had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many before him. The final night. Jacob never spoke of what he had seen in Black Hollow. No matter how many questions were asked, how many curious souls came to him with eager eyes and trembling voices, he remained silent. The weight of that place, the chilling figure, and the relentless whispers had followed him, wrapping themselves around his thoughts and dreams. He could feel them in the stillness of the night, hear them in the rustling leaves of the trees outside his window. But there were others who had heard the tale of Black Hollow and, like him, sought the truth. Perhaps they were braver, or foolish enough, to chase the whispers themselves. Word spread, as it always did in small towns, and before long, the cursed town of Black Hollow was attracting new visitors, unwilling to let go of the mystery. Among these seekers was a man named Elias Ward, a descendant of one of the town's earliest settlers. His family had long since abandoned the land, but the stories had been passed down through the generations. Elias had heard them too, whispers of the night walkers, of the cursed fate that befell Black Hollow. But unlike Jacob, Elias was not afraid. He was driven by something else, the desire to bring his family's legacy to light, to uncover what had happened to the town, and perhaps to put an end to the darkness that lingered. Elias arrived on a night much like the one Jacob had, under a sky thick with clouds, where the moon hid behind an ever-thickening veil. The fog rolled in from the valley, swallowing the land whole, and the air felt alive with an energy Jacob couldn't place. As he made his way to the outskirts of Black Hollow, Elias felt the pull, the same tug Jacob had felt all those months ago, the urge to uncover the truth, to walk into the belly of the beast. He wasn't alone, of course. Several others had joined him, brave souls, all eager to solve the mystery that had plagued their families for years. A few spoke of finding treasure hidden within the town's ruins, others of proving the legends wrong. But Elias sought something different. He wanted to confront the shadows, to understand the curse that had lingered in Black Hollow. The group made their way through the dense forest, their lanterns flickering in the thick fog, casting long shadows on the ground. The deeper they went, the quieter the forest became, as though the land itself had grown afraid of what was to come. Even the animals had gone silent, leaving only the crunch of their footsteps beneath the heavy air. When they reached the town, the eerie quiet had returned, like a shroud of death hanging over the broken buildings. The ruins of Black Hollow stood like silent sentinels, broken and decaying. No sign of life remained. The town seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And as Elias stepped forward, he could feel it, the weight of all that had happened there, the darkness that pressed against him from all sides. The group wandered the streets, calling out to any remaining townsfolk, hoping for some sign of life. But there was nothing. Only the wind whispering through the broken windows and the occasional rustling of leaves. The further they ventured into the heart of Black Hollow, the heavier the air became. And it wasn't long before Elias felt that familiar chill creeping down his spine, the sensation that they were being watched. Suddenly the temperature dropped. The lanterns flickered and went out one by one, swallowed by the darkness. The group froze, their breath visible in the cold air. And then, as if summoned by some unseen force, the whispers began. It was faint at first, the sound of distant murmurs, too soft to understand. But then the whispers grew louder, twisting and winding through the air, curling around the group like smoke. They were no longer distant. They were here all around them. A language they could not comprehend, but one that seemed to pull at their very souls. Elias's heart raced. The stories were true. Black Hollow was no myth, it was a place cursed by the darkness, a place where the dead did not rest. And then, from the shadows they came. Figures, tall, shadowy forms, appeared at the edge of the town, their faces hidden in darkness, their bodies shifting in and out of the mist. They moved silently, their footsteps barely making a sound, their presence heavy in the air. The group stood frozen, fear rooting them to the spot. But Elias, driven by the same curiosity that had brought him here, stepped forward, his voice trembling but loud enough to echo through the silent town. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figures did not answer. Instead, they began to move closer, their forms growing clearer with every step. Elias could see their eyes now, pale, glowing, like ghosts trapped in the land. And when they spoke, their voices were a chorus of whispers, the same that had haunted Black Hollow for centuries. "You should not have come," they said, their voices thick with sorrow and malice. "This place is not for the living." The group backed away, panic setting in. But it was too late. The darkness closed in around them, the figures enveloping them in their cold, suffocating grasp. The whispers grew louder until they drowned out all other sounds. Elias felt the world shift, his body growing heavy, his mind clouded. The ground beneath him seemed to give way, and before he knew it, he was sinking down into the very earth, swallowed by the darkness of Black Hollow. When the morning light broke through the trees, the town was still and silent once again. No sign of Elias or his companions remained. The ruins of Black Hollow stood undisturbed, as if they had never been there at all. And so, the town that died in the dark remained a mystery, a place that no one dared speak of, but that still whispered on the wind, calling to those who were foolish enough to seek its secrets. For Black Hollow was not just a town, it was a warning, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was thin, and where the darkness would forever claim those who sought to uncover its truths. And to this day, if you listen carefully on a still, foggy night, you may hear the whispers of Black Hollow, beckoning to you from the shadows. But be warned, once you hear them you may never leave. This concludes the tale of the town that died in the dark. Let me know if you need any changes or if you'd like to explore another story.